Welcome to the last session for our conference today, Central Asia in the Global Context. My name is Andy Kuchins, and I'm a senior fellow and research professor here with the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. And I'm really honored to be chairing this afternoon panel, which I know is going to be fantastic given the participants that we have. I personally am not a Central Asian specialist by any stretch of the imagination, but I did get quite involved with doing work on the region going back 7 or 8 years ago, initially with a large project at CSIS to study the Northern Distribution Network, these being the new transit corridors which would supply our troops in Afghanistan with a larger footprint, and with the increase and the requirements of materials going in, and the concern that we were dependent upon one ground lock of communication at that time through the port of Karachi and then right through enemy territory into Afghanistan. And from that project, it led myself and our team members to think about a regional economic cooperation strategy for Afghanistan, which we called a modern Silk Road strategy at the time. And the principal idea was that to get buy-in from Afghanistan's regional neighbors for stability in Afghanistan and economic development in Afghanistan, and that they would benefit therefrom from this kind of connectivity. And then from that, it took us at CSIS the project I was referring to in the previous, in Roger Kangis's session, all about reconnecting Eurasia. And there is something really big going on the supercontinent of Eurasia, from Europe to East Asia, from Russia to India, and that it's reconnecting in a multitude of ways. Much of it is driven by economic ties, but lots of connectivity in other ways. And this phenomenon is not particularly well understood, and I'm looking forward to turning away from Russia at the end of this semester and preparing for a new course at Georgetown called Reconnecting Eurasia. So enough about me, and turn to our panelists, because Central Asia, in a way, is right there at the center, at the heart of Eurasia. Every country in Central Asia, every country in the South Caucasus, every country in Europe, the Chinese, are, of course, the most notable, are developing strategies, economic strategies, political strategies around this phenomenon. So in a way, that's kind of just a background for our discussion about Central Asia in the global context. I'm going to introduce our speakers briefly, and then we'll go in the order of Ambassador Bill Courtney, who is currently an adjunct senior fellow at RAND and president of the U.S.-Kazakhstan Business Association. In 2014, he retired from Computer Sciences Corporation as a senior principal for federal policy strategy. From 1972 to 1999, he was a foreign service officer, and he served as the special assistant to the president for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, ambassador to Georgia, Kazakhstan, our first ambassador to Kazakhstan, I believe, yes, and the U.S.-Soviet Commission that implemented the Threshold Test Ban Treaty. Our second speaker will then turn to Paul Stronski, and Paul is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment's Russia and Eurasia program, a group near and dear to me. I spent quite a bit of time there with the Carnegie Endowment, and his research focuses on the relationship between Russia and neighboring countries in Central Asia and the South Caucasus. And until January 2015, Paul served also as a senior analyst for Russian domestic politics in the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, INR. He was director for Russia and Central Asia on the U.S. National Security Council staff, 2012 to 2014, and before that worked as a State Department analyst on Russia, 2011 to 2012, and on Armenia and Azerbaijan, 2007 to 2010. And he is the author, of course, of an excellent book entitled Tashkent, Forging a Soviet City, 1930 to 1966. An eventful year in Tashkent it was. Then we'll turn to our third speaker, Professor Zhao, who is a senior research fellow at the National Strategy Institute of Tsinghua University, where he works on issues related to China's foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and more recently, civil-military integration. Dr. Zhao has worked on a range of issues from North Korea, the South China Sea, the Belt and Road Initiative to counterterrorism in China at the Institute. You're a very busy guy there. That's quite a portfolio. He received his PhD in international history from the University of Chicago and also studied at the Johns Hopkins University Nanjing Center for Chinese and American Studies. And last and far from least is Dr. Alexander Cooley, who is the Clare Towe Professor of Political Science at Barnard College and also the director of the Columbia University's Harriman Institute, which is keeping him extremely busy as for the study of Russia, Eurasia, and Eastern Europe. Professor Cooley's research examines how external actors have influenced the development and sovereignty of the former Soviet states with a focus on Central Asia and the Caucasus. Many of us are familiar with his terrific book, Great Games, Local Rules, The New Great Power Contest for Central Asia 2012. And we must congratulate Alex because his new book entitled Dictators Without Borders has just come out in the last month from Yale. Congratulations. It's a great title, Dictators Without Borders. So look forward to hearing a bit more about the book, because I think some of the things you'll say is sort of developed from some of the concepts that you've worked on there. So with no further ado, let me turn it over to Ambassador Courtney.
Great. Andy, thank you very much. And Angela, thank you for hosting this, and Chevron for sponsoring. This has been a very insightful conference. When I think sometimes of how much attention Russia gets in Washington compared to non-Russian republics, it's really important that conferences like this take place. In the great game of the 19th century, Britain and Russia competed for influence in Afghanistan and neighboring areas. This great game is no more. Today, Central Asians worry about declining attention from Western great powers and about balancing pressures and opportunities from nearby great powers. In my remarks, I will include Azerbaijan as part of wider Central Asia, and I will also speak of four great powers, China, Europe, Russia, and America. I will argue two main points. First, Caspian energy drives much of the West's interest in Central Asia. And two, the West is more likely to support Central Asian countries that make democratic progress. Let's consider possible dimensions of great power interest in Central Asia. Trade. Trade with Central Asia is of little importance to the West, and really only modest importance to Russia and China. In 2016, European Union trade with the top four Central Asian partners was only 0.9% of all EU external trade. Last year, Kazakhstan, despite belonging to the Eurasian Economic Union, was only 12th largest trading partner of Russia, accounting for just 2.9% of Russia's trade. Foreign direct investment, or FDI, is more important to the great powers than is trade. According to the World Bank, in 2015, the three energy powerhouses of Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Turkmenistan, dominated FDI inflows into the region. Kazakhstan received $6.6 billion, Turkmenistan $4.3 billion, and Azerbaijan $4.1 billion, for a total of $14.9 billion of FDI inflows into those three countries. This was 2.3 times higher than all FDI inflows into Russia. This gap is striking, but of course it owes in part to Western sanctions on Russia. China's FDI in Central Asia substantially exceeds Russia's. According to UNCTAD, in 2012, Chinese investment in Kazakhstan of $2.9 billion was nearly 3 times higher than Russia's. This difference may widen as China invests more in its Silk Road belt while Russia's economy flags. Despite the bonds of the Eurasian Economic Union, Russia's economic role in Central Asia may decline relative to China's. Caspian energy is important to all the great powers. According to the BP Statistical Review of World Energy, in 2015, Kazakhstan produced 1.8% of global crude oil, Azerbaijan 1.0%, and Turkmenistan 0.3%, for a total of 3.0% of global crude output. This exceeds even Mexico's contribution. The Tengiz field in Kazakhstan is one of the world's 10 largest crude oil fields and the deepest producing supergiant. Last year, Chevron and its partners, including ExxonMobil, announced a $37 billion Tengiz expansion project. Last year as well, the long-delayed Kashagan project, into which $50 billion has been invested, began producing crude. In the years ahead, that output should grow substantially. As newer energy sources emerge, such as shale, tight oil, and Arctic, it is essential that Caspian energy remain globally competitive for investment. This will require more economic reforms. Central Asia's location is a compelling interest for China and Russia, but less so for Western great powers. For China, the region is a secure source of oil and gas and a land bridge for some Silk Road routes. For Russia, Central Asia is a source of millions of migrant laborers, as Maureen was pointing out this morning, and some agricultural and mineral products. Kazakhstan exports a huge amount of oil through the Russian pipeline system, mostly to the Black Sea port of Novorossiysk. Central Asia's historical and cultural ties with Russia are deep, but much less so with the West and China. Most Central Asians speak Russian and watch Russian television. Few speak Chinese or absorb its culture. Some young people in Central Asia study English or are exposed to the West through social media. Several thousand young Kazakhstanis have studied in the West. A concern for the future is that politics in Central Asia may have to accommodate rising expectations by younger populations. Russia has far greater security interests in Central Asia than do China or the West. In Kazakhstan, Russia conducts missile and space launches at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. Russia's 201st Motorized Rifle Division is based in Tajikistan. In Kyrgyzstan, Russia operates an air base and a torpedo testing range. No other great power is likely to have a major military base in Central Asia. Russia worries about the flow northward of violent extremists and their ideas and the inflow of narcotics from the south. The April 3rd terrorist strike in St. Petersburg reinforces those concerns. Some narcotics from the south traverse Russia on their way to Europe, and that is a concern there. China's security concerns in Central Asia are less substantial than Russia's. Last year, Tajikistan announced that China would fund construction of border outposts on the Afghan border. China is worried about Uyghur fighters coming from ISIS battlegrounds. As China's economic interests in Central Asia grow, however, Beijing may pay more attention to regional security. As we've often said about U.S. diplomacy historically, sometimes the flag follows trade. After the 2001 Al-Qaeda attacks, the West had strong security interests in Central Asia, as was discussed earlier, mainly relating to logistical support for NATO forces in Afghanistan. In recent years, however, this role has declined. Turning to political engagement, of the great powers, Russia is the most interested in Central Asia. Russia sees the region as part of its sphere of influence. For now, China defers to Russia on political engagement, although that may change over time. After the Soviet collapse, the West stated strong support for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all former Soviet states. This policy continues, but in practice, the level of support may vary. The key reason is the degree of political and economic liberalism. Let's make a comparison with Georgia and Ukraine. Both are developing democratically, and the Western great powers give them passionate support. When Russia invaded Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014, America provided substantial political, economic, and military support. When last January it seemed that President Trump might ease sanctions related to Russia's intervention in Ukraine, prominent U.S. senators of both parties raised strong objection and introduced bipartisan bills to increase sanctions and prevent their premature easing. Summing up reasons why the great powers are interested in Central Asia: trade, FDI, energy, location, historical and cultural ties, security, and political. Several conclusions may be of special note. First, in the economic domain, since trade is less important than FDI and energy, good investment climates and energy policies are critical. Second, to develop their energy resources, Caspian energy states should cooperate with all of the great powers. Third, the U.S. strategy of multiple pipelines still works. Routes through Russia and the South Caucasus and to China reduce the risks of monopolistic transport. Fourth, Russia will remain the dominant security player in Central Asia, although China's role will likely grow. Fifth, Central Asian countries should hedge against the risk of future crises in which they may need Western support. And the best way to do this is by increasing political and economic openness. Thank you.
Bill, you are a model of concision and insight. Paul, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, and thanks for having me at this session. I would agree with a lot of what Ambassador Courtney said about the U.S. and the West and the interest, their interest in Central Asia is in decline, and then I think this is also of increasing concern to Central Asian states itself. But I also would argue that the U.S. And the European Union have never placed Central Asia into a high priority category. It is far away, even from the European Union. It doesn't border it. So it's not really covered in its Eastern Partnership. And it poses no direct threat to either the U.S., its allies, or the European Union. So the policies about Central Asia of both places have been often about something else as opposed to about Central Asia, whether it is Russia, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's energy security, whether it is Islamic extremism and the fears of Islamic extremism. And as Professor Kangas has gone through, I mean, we've had some successful policies, some not. First 10 years, it was all about sovereignty and sort of building up these states, securing nuclear material. If you look at Kazakhstan today and Kazakhstan 20 years ago, that's sort of a success. Also about creating alternate transportation routes, giving Russia less leverage over the region. That also is a success, but not a US one, more of a Chinese one. And then after that, everything became about Afghanistan. And that, with Afghanistan, the drawdown, the region and Western policy towards the region, I would argue, is basically in limbo. And this has gotten worse in the past few years as the West becomes consumed with internal crises, whether it's in the United States, the political problems here, or in the European Union, or just bigger issues elsewhere, Syria, Middle East, Libya, you name it, they're there. I would also agree, energy markets are changing, but beyond energy, there is little trade ties between the West and Russia. Yes, if you add up all European countries, you can see that EU is a top investor in Kazakhstan, but a lot of that investment is actually offshore coming back into Kazakhstan. And the investor climate, as I think we've discussed before, is really not conducive. And NATO is once again, it's not focused on Afghanistan like it was. It's focused on Russia, but Central Asia doesn't really factor in that as well because they're focused on threats to NATO's eastern flank, not threats to farther afield. And I would also, see when you look at both the European Union and the U.S. trying to sort of deal with the Russia problem and the Ukraine problem, I think those are the top priorities, and whatever the future of Central Asia relations will be contingent on both of those entities coming up with their policies and their next policies on Russia and then Ukraine. Moving beyond the West, I would also argue and see China as the most sort of dynamic and important economic actor now in Central Asia. Its focus has been on trade, energy, infrastructure development. And I think the question we all need to think about is, as this economic influence continues to increase, what sort of role will China feel it need to play to secure those investments? But again, I think if you look at Chinese policy, you can also see that some of this is not exactly related to Central Asia itself, but it is derivative to other issues. Chinese are looking for markets for their excess infrastructure and building capacities, and Central Asia is a logical place to turn. They are focusing in on stabilizing and securing the border and making sure that any instability from Afghanistan or potentially from Central Asia does not bubble into Xinjiang and into China. And they are hoping to link factories and production centers to markets in the West, and Central Asia is a way that they can see doing this. But again, and how they're going about doing it, I don't see a whole lot of focus on developing the Central Asian economies themselves, except as sort of transit space. And even the Central Asian countries, most of them see infrastructure development. They see the One Belt, One Road as the panacea to all their economic problems. And they are themselves not thinking about how they can benefit or take advantage of the infrastructure that is going to be going through. I would also argue, and I expect Alex to talk a little bit about this too, but some of the Chinese investment going into the region is not necessarily solving the region's problems. It is fueling corruption, fueling the rentier system. It's not necessarily bubbling down to the people who need it. It is not necessarily alleviating poverty. So if one of the goals of Chinese investment is stabilizing the region, it's unclear how effective this is currently, and it will be in the long term. Russia is the other big player in the room. It is on the retreat. For the first 20 years, it seemed to be able to sort of keep its monopoly over trade, export routes, but China over the last decade has really sort of dug into that. Russia remains economically important, and it remains an important security, potential security provider in the region, or a security problem in the region as well. But Russia also remains stretched thin with its war in Ukraine, war in Syria, that it's unclear whether it has the capacity to deal with something long-term in Central Asia. And I think I won't go into. I think we've talked a little bit about migration, so I'm not going to go into that. But that remains an important tool of Russian economic influence in the region. The signature initiative, the Eurasian Union, I would argue has had limited success at best. Concern over what Russia was doing in Ukraine has really heightened governments. Concern over any sort of political aspects of the Eurasian Union, all of which have been pretty much stripped out. And the Eurasian Union really hasn't jump-started the economy, hasn't jump-started trade like many of the countries have hoped. And you have two states that, in Central Asia that are pretty fierce in trying to resist joining the Eurasian Union, and Tajikistan is still trying to keep it at bay to the best that it can. Now with Central Asia and Russia, I think some of Russian policies are clearly about Central Asia itself, but I think they too fall in this pattern of having policies that are more geared towards their own domestic issues. And this idea that Russia needs to have a sphere of influence, and this idea that Russia, needs to protect Kazakhstan. I think it's become more important after their loss of Ukraine and Georgia. It's important to the Russian public. It's important to the Russian government domestically. So I think preserving its influence there plays a role. I do think Russia wants to see a long-term sort of security belt of friendly or at least neutral states around it to protect it from threats, whether that is a threat that they perceive coming from NATO or the threat coming from the south from instability that I think we've mentioned before, whether it's in Afghanistan or the Middle East. But I think if you sort of look at some rising problems of extremism in Russia itself, I'm not sure if some of those policies, particularly its policies towards Syria, could actually be fueling some of the instability that Russia is facing. And I think you see it with a growing number of extremists from Central Asia in Russia and elsewhere. Now, I'm briefly going to talk about a few other states that I see as having some potential. One is Iran, and the prospect of lifting sanctions, no matter what President Trump ultimately does vis-a-vis Iran, I think it does open up economic and strategic opportunities for Central Asia and Iran itself. Iran is a huge market that Central Asia could take advantage of. It is also a relatively stable place through which to build transportation arteries and infrastructure for energy export to the Persian Gulf, enabling them to connect to South Asia, to Europe, in ways that the TAPI has proven elusive. But Iran's engagement with the region brings a lot of problems as well. I mean, just the sort of ideology of Iran and the sort of the conflicts that it brings immediately with the secular regimes in Central Asia. But also, Iran has enormous economic potential of itself. It's got great reserves of hydrocarbons and could end up being a competitor to the region as well. So it's kind of a mixed bag. And then just two others that I'm going to mention. One is Japan. Which has had very high profile engagement since the 2000s. And it is seen in the region as a potential partner in diversifying its economy and creating greater technical expertise. I think South Korea also does this quite well. It is also seen as welcomed. Both Korea and Japan are seen as pro-Western, but they generally lack the same sort of focus on human rights, democracy that the West has. So they get some of the benefits without some of the complicated aspects to it. And I also would argue, in the last 10 years, Japan's engagement with the region has also been, to make sure it's present as China increases its sway as a counterweight to China. And the other one is India, which I think also is present in the region for multiple reasons. One, it is energy hungry. And it sees lucrative commodities that it can try and increase its trade with. I think India also sees potential insecurity emanating from Central Asia, more specifically through Afghanistan and Pakistan. It sees the Central Asian governments as a partner in addressing that issue. But I also would say as China sort of expands its ambitions and sort of influence in other parts of Asia, not just Central Asia, I think India is increasingly looking towards Central Asia as also a place where it can serve as a counterweight. And with that, I will move it on.
Excellent, Paul. You covered a lot of points and a lot of places that I'm sure there'll be a follow-up discussion about. Dr. Zhao, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. So in the beginning, I probably want to follow Paul's last point about India, because that's quite interesting and it's rising recently. Because India has, half-heartedly support China's One Belt and One Road initiative, particularly the CPAC program across Pakistan, because they think the way that going from Kashgar to Gwadar, going through Pakistan, it's going through the Kashmir region, which is in dispute. And so India is now very happy about it. And also, this line is vertical line, and they wanted to more have a branch going east-westward that can bring India, part of India, also into the program, so that India can be benefited. And interestingly, so India is kind of increasing its relations and investment in Afghanistan so that they can work together against Pakistan in that way to hedge China's influence in the region. So I think that's one point. About Central Asia, I think a lot of China's position has been covered by previous speakers, I think, pretty well. So I would follow probably the previous sort of review of history. So China's position in Central Asia is a strategic goal is to pursue peace and stability in the region, and also safe borders, relatively independence from the outside influence. So no matter Russia's influence, the US influence, China wanted the Central Asia states to remain relatively independent. And China has claimed repeatedly that China has no intention of dominating the region, but just to make sure it's safe. And also China wants to build Central Asia as a buffer zone against the so-called three isms. That is terrorism, extremism, and separatism. However, after the Russian activity in Crimea, it's hard to insist on separatism. But then also on separatism, there's another problem that is nationalism, because after the independence of those Central Asia countries, a lot of countries have the same ethnic population within China. For example, Kazakhstan. We have a huge population of Kazakhs living within China, and sometimes their view can be influenced by Kazakh state, and which is not in line with the Chinese. So they're creating a problem as well. So one of the key point after 1991, the China's relations with Central Asia states is to make sure that the relations been reversed from the Cold War era. Because during the Cold War, when Central Asia as a part of Soviet Union, China felt a lot of pressure from the north, not only from northeast, but also from northwest. And after the independence of these states, China approached those states in trying to start the negotiation of borderline, because China shared over 3,000 kilometers borderline with Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. So they started negotiation, and after a while, I think by 2003, they finished all negotiations, and all the dispute has been settled. And then, even before that, in 1996 and 1997, China negotiated with Russia and Central Asia countries to reduce border military presence and also reduce tensions over that region. So that sort of set the stage for further economic cooperation, because now you have a more free flow of people, of goods, and safer border. That's one of the big achievements. And after that, there's a big change coming in 2001. That's when the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was established. In the beginning, it was sort of taken aback because right after the establishment, there is 9/11. And the US strong presence in the region sort of impeded China's further development with those countries. Those, particularly Uzbekistan, actually stepped back and saying we're not really actively participating in SCO. But what happened in 2003 when the US invaded Iraq, that dynamic changed back. And since 2003, China not only established joint military exercise, counterterrorism exercise with Central Asia countries, but also established counterterrorism centers, so agency, increased intelligence communication, increased coordination with those countries. And as mentioned before, China's secondary and third pursuit in the region is energy and trade. For energy, since 1993, China has become a net energy importer, particularly oil and gas. And the thing is, China does not only want a supply of energy, but it also wants safe energy. And China considers Malacca it's not safe. And also a single source. For example, if we're too concentrated on the source from Russia, it's going to be dangerous. So China tried to diversify the energy sources from different regions, not only from the Middle East, but also from Russia, and then mostly from Central Asia. That's why China focused on Kazakhstan and trying to get more oil and gas from the region. So far, I think China has built 4 pipelines to transport oil and gas from the region, and it's sort of succeeded in that area. And so far, China has become the #1 importer of energies exported from the region. Then about trade, trade increased more dramatically. Since the beginning of bilateral relations between China and Central Asia countries till probably last year, the trade increased about 80-fold, if I remember correctly. So that's a dramatic change in terms of trade. However, in terms of the structure of trade, that doesn't change too much because China wanted to push the trade structure according to China's pace. And China realized free trade zone with a lot of countries and also Southeast Asia. So China also wanted to push the idea of free trade zone with Central Asia countries, which sort of didn't realize. So they step back and say, okay, we don't want free trade zone probably, we just want more convenient flow of people. But so far, as you can see in Central Asia, there's a lot of barriers for China's investment, for China's visas to get people across, and also goods in terms of certification and all kinds of non-tariff barriers, which is to some extent was set by Russians, because Russia doesn't want China to be sort of economically too integrated with the region, other than security reasons. Because of China's energy demand from the region, China's initial investment in industries sort of related to the energy production. So China came in and say, we wanted to invest in infrastructure, road, bridges, electricity, mining equipment that will help those countries to export more energy and resources to China. Other than gas and oil, China also import a large amount of other resources like metal, minerals, and like fur, wood, all kinds of raw materials from the region. However, recently China's economy cooled quite a bit, and I recently traveled to Xinjiang and surveyed the border towns, and they say the trade sort of decreased very significantly just looking at the freighter train going through the border area. So come back to the problem of the question of OBOR. Well, we're now saying it's One Belt, One Road. I'm using Belt and Road Initiative. As you probably know, initially, it's interesting because Roger just now talked about 2011. I think that's a critical year when not only the US decided to draw down military in Afghanistan, but also several other things happened prior and after. In 2009, particularly 2010, the US started to have the policy of pivot to Asia, which really affected China quite a bit. And China started to restart its strategic goal in the eastward towards Japan and the United States. And right after that, 2011, there's a huge protest in Russia against Putin. And then 2012, China has a huge dispute with Japan on the Diaoyu Islands. And then a year later, the Philippines sued China in the International Tribunal Court, a permanent court. So this series of events sort of warn China and give China the impression that the US is going back to a containment policy. And China worried that the pressure from eastward needs to be dealt with. So then at that time, China's think tank started to advocate that we should move westward. And also picked up the word Silk Road. That's why in I think September or October of 2013, President Xi Jinping started to talk about the Belt and Road, and then later Belt and Road Initiative. So the beginning of OBOR is actually strategic. However, as Paul just said, immediately there's another component, which is economic component coming into it, because in 2008, after the financial crisis in the United States, China was affected and then injected a huge amount of money into the economic system, which created an oversupply. And China needs to find a way to solve the oversupply. Of course, this OBOR problem is one way to create market and sort of transfer production capacity over to other part of the world. So that's when this policy got domestic support. However, OBOR came out in sort of rush. There's no detailed plan until March of 2015, which is not really detailed. So this is sort of a banner, and all the programs has been there, like shovel-ready programs, and then they subscribed to this whole thing called OBOR. And that's where they started to grow. However, if you look at the total investment and the direction, most of the money going to Southeast Asia and South Asia. So very little going to Central Asia, just as mentioned before as well. But still, President Xi Jinping has this grand plan, and the local, particularly on the provincial level, they want to push forward. So particularly after 2014, Xinjiang province started to advocate strongly that Xinjiang should be the center for this future envisioned China-Central Asia integration. They imagined Kashgar as a central city that is sort of projecting towards Pakistan and Afghanistan, and they also imagined Urumqi and other cities in northern Xinjiang projecting to Central Asia countries. So in that way, they requested a huge amount of money, and the the central government actually authorized about $200 billion just last year to invest in infrastructures in Xinjiang. So before they go in to build infrastructures outside China, they started to build within China. And also because of the counterterrorism need and also the worry about terrorism rising and religious problems rising in Xinjiang, and the decreasing of Han Chinese in Xinjiang, they started to adopt a new policy, which is to migrate more Han Chinese back into Xinjiang, and also to separate or to reestablish the Xinjiang production and construction corps into a civilian organization, and changing divisions into cities, and changing division commanders into city mayors. So that way they sort of they are right now creating about 10 new cities in Xinjiang with majority of Han Chinese. So that's the way to sort of counter the trend of dropping population and also the growing of Islamic influence in the region. So overall, I think from this point on, there will be the government is determined to still follow this track of Ober, and Central Asia will be a very important region for China to focus on. However, China is worried that that this China-Russia relation is going to take priority, and China does not want Russia to feel uncomfortable. So every time we talk about SCO or Ober, we always add one sentence that the Eurasia Economic Union is, we're going to be in cooperation or in coordination with that union, and we can build a sort of overall integration and to promote regional economic development from that perspective. So I think moving forward, this kind of economic development, regional integration will still take first seat, and then China's involvement in security matters still be limited and behind Russia. And also other countries' involvement, particularly American involvement, to some extent actually is welcomed by China. Okay, I'll just stop here. Welcome questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zhao. A really interesting presentation. We look forward to further discussion about some of the issues that you raised. Alex.
All right, thanks so much. So thank you for the invitation today. It's a pleasure to be part of such a distinguished panel. Thank you to CERES. You run wonderful events as well as a terrific program here, so it's always a pleasure and an honor. My presentation today is going to be about Central Asia and the world. It's going to be a little bit different than most of the geopolitical analysis I've done before, although this grew out of a review of my co-author in this project, my previous book, John Heathershaw at the University of Exeter, who liked the corruption chapter in Great Games Local Rules, and particularly liked the sort of the discussion of the different kinds of transnational networks that were involved in some of those deals. And so we got talking, and a few years later, and many missed deadlines, we came out with Dictators Without Borders. Power and money in Central Asia, and really it's about power and money in and out of Central Asia. Really that's the kind of the first theme here. We ground the book in what we call our 3 myths of Central Asian politics, right? And 3 myths of the way that at times various constituencies, both in academia and in policymaking, have tended to look at Central Asian politics. The myth of global isolation, the myth of partial or incomplete liberalization and reform, and the myth of local traditionalism. So, as we've heard on many occasions, and this is from Washington to Beijing, and as Paul and Andy mentioned, everyone has their own connectivity scheme, right, at Central Asia. Everyone wants to rewire Central Asia in a particular type of way. But I think embedded in some of these accounts, not all, of connectivity is this idea that somehow Central Asia is isolated, right? That it's not part of the functioning international system, that Central Asia is somehow not embedded in global financial and legal structures. And we think that's quite false. There are other metrics that we could come up with that could show a lot of integration in Central Asia. This is actually a chart of Central Asia trade with China and Russia. Actually, the start date's 2001, not 1991, 2001 to 2010. And you see trade with China in blue exploding and trade with Russia also increasing. So that could be one metric. Remittances that we talked about this morning, that could be another. Tajikistan is the most remittance dependent economy in the world. Kyrgyzstan sometimes is second. How about capital flight? Tajikistan, according to the IMF, lost 65% of its GDP to capital flight. That's a ludicrous number, right? In the virtual economies of Russia in the 1990s, this figure was 10 to 12%. How about money laundering? Asia Universal Bank in Kyrgyzstan under the Bakiyevs, Kyrgyz prosecutors claimed that $1 trillion went through Asia Universal. That became this global hub. And in this report, grave secrecy, Global Witness showed how there were opened hundreds and hundreds of correspondent accounts through that particular bank. And this was a bank that was mentioned in the most recent article on the so-called shadow ledger of Paul Manafort sort of companies. So part of the question that we want to ask in the book is the problem a lack of connectivity per se, or is it actually the wrong types of connectivity? Or what cures Central Asia development, the lack of connections, or rather too much kleptocracy and capital flight? There's a second myth that we want to look at, and that is partial liberalization. And in fact, what we see is centrally, and yes, this is true to a certain extent. We still have capital account controls in places like Uzbekistan and in Turkmenistan. But what we see is a very particular type of integration, legal integration, and the use of anonymous shell companies throughout the region in all sorts of transactions. So what do offshore vehicles do? They minimize tax liability, quite legally. They facilitate capital flight. They conceal national origins of investments. They provide official actors plausible deniability. Now, there are international guidelines on the use of shell companies, that if you purchase a shell company in whatever jurisdiction, you need to provide your identity and a notarized copy of your passport or other identity documents. It's the FATF guideline. What we see in reality, and this was a study of a co-author of mine with some of his authors, they sent 7,400 email solicitations to service company providers all around the world. And of that sample, 600 posed as Central Asian officials who were involved in government procurement. This was the sort of corruption treatment. The idea behind the study was to see whether shell company providers all around the world would actually sell a company without the proper legal documentation. And so this is sort of an example of the corruption treatment here. And pretty much every red flag regarding corruption is put in, right? We're government officials, we're involved in government procurement, we want to deal solely on email because we're really busy and we move around a lot and so forth. And these are just typical refusals that you had here. Thank you, no thank you. No problem, I should concentrate on making an honest living. You seem like a bright guy. And this is what a compliant response looks like, right? And actually, this is from St. Kitts and Nevis, right? Yeah, no problem, but here's what we're going to need. Certified copy of information, your driver's license, reference letters. Here are the non-compliant responses, typically. And these are both from U.S. service providers, right? All you need to do is provide the name you want for a new company. That's it. Bottom line is, and this is the sort of dodgy shopping count that they came up with, it's actually the OECD countries that were least compliant. And in particular, over here on the right, actual service company providers, not law firms, and in particular, service company providers in Wyoming and Delaware, right, and Nevada, those three states, right? So when we talk about connectivity in this sort of way, there is ample experimental and actual evidence that I get through that we are an integral part of facilitating this capital flight and offshore world. This is data from FDI Kazakhstan, 2012. I think Paul alluded to this too. So looking at this chart, you might say, wow, the Netherlands really invests a lot in Kazakhstan. In fact, over half of sort of FDI going in and out comes from the Netherlands. British Virgin Islands is in there. And in fact, I know Nazarbayev has sometimes a ceremony where he invites the ambassadors from leading FDI sources and so forth. Or you can say, what kinds of companies are registering themselves in the Netherlands? And in fact, is this sort of just facilitating round tripping from offshore accounts back here? And actually, no other Central Asian bank, central bank sort of publishes regularly sort of sources of FDI flows, but these are the Kazakh ones. Well, there's the case of Talco, Tajik aluminum company in Tajikistan, responsible for over 50% of GDP, its exports. For 4 years, they were involved in a London litigation over the ownership and embezzlement expropriation. They racked up about $150 to $200 million in legal fees. At the time, it was the most expensive court case in UK history. What comes out of the proceedings is a map where all of Talco's management and tolling arrangements are deeply embedded in offshore structures. And it's a very complicated ownership story, and it's one in which the IMF has repeatedly criticized them for being opaque as to who owns what. Final myth is the myth of local tradition, right? We had a big debate in political science in the 1990s over clan politics in Central Asia, right? How important are clans and informal networks and so forth? One of the arguments we make in the book is Central Asian elites do have multiple identities, but they also tend to have global identities in addition to their local ones or national ones. How do Central Asians acquire global residency in regimes? They get passports through serving in the diplomatic service, right, such as Gulnara Karimova, who was ambassador in a number of jurisdictions. They can purchase citizenship, and in fact, there's a booming industry, second citizenship providers, right, Central Asia, some of the sort of leading clients of some of these global firms, or they apply for political asylum. Right? And I think part of the paradox here is exactly because Central Asia is authoritarian in nature, that if you are an exile or a political dissident or a former regime insider and you flee to the West, you are actually protected by the political asylum laws in countries like the UK, the US, Australia. So 3 kind of principal mechanisms. Here's an advertisement from HF Corporation touting all their great Kazakh clienteles. There's some interesting data that's out now. This is the initial Tier 1 Visa UK program, right? In exchange for £2 million investment, you get residency. And actually, Kazakhstan is number 6, right? 1 and 2 are citizens from Russia and China. They make out about a quarter of the Tier 1 visas. But the Kazakhs, when 41 Kazakhs were granted those. We tried to FOIA the names, but we didn't get them. Globalizing Central Asian bloc. So if we accept that there's some issues in all of these sorts of perspectives, what kinds of arguments can we make if we start thinking about Central Asia in this more kind of selected global kind of perspective? And sort of we come out with sort of 3 basic arguments that inform our kind of anecdotal illustrative cases. One is, as domestic political space tightens, Central Asian political, economic, legal contestation takes place outside of the region, right? 2, the pursuit of exiles and the recovery of overseas assets become an unstated foreign policy priority, right? It's not going to be listed in the MFA doctrine in any Central Asian states, but it is in practice incredibly important. And then we make this distinction between the robust transnational networks and ties Central Asian elites versus embattled and impoverished sort of transnational NGO and sort of civil society. So these are just sort of, the basic downward trajectory and sort of Freedom House scores. You see all these happening. Usually at this point, the conversation goes to, well, yes, we all know there's authoritarianism in Central Asia, but for all the reasons we talked about this morning, Roger alluded to them, liberal democracy just didn't take place. The Central Asian states learned how to consolidate power. Hey, maybe Central Asian publics prize legitimacy and stability above all. But to me, that part of the conversation is unsatisfying, right? Because I think politics is always present and political contestation always takes place. The question is, where do we look for it, right? Do we look for it in Kazakhstan itself? Do we look for it in Tajikistan? Do we look for it within Uzbekistan? Yes, we will find political competition dynamics there. But we also have categories of political processes taking place outside the region that we don't normally think about as political contestation, right? And this occurs with former regime insiders fleeing, as Mr. Krapunov, former Ministry of Energy and Mayor of Almaty. It happens in the politicization of the Interpol Red Notice list, and it happens in accusations of money laundering, which with greater and greater frequency is used by Central Asian governments to prompt other regulators in Western governments to investigate political opponents overseas. Who's an exile? Sort of different sort of category, former regime insiders, members of opposition political parties, banned clerics and religious extremists, independent journalists, academics, civil society activists. Here's two prominent ones. Mr. Kazagheldin on the left, you might be familiar with, former Prime Minister of Kazakhstan, came out of an intent to challenge Nazarbayev, fled to Switzerland, now lives in London. This is Maxim Bakiev, son of Kurmanbek Bakiev, former president of Kyrgyzstan, whose regime collapsed after street protests in 2010. He resides safely in Surrey, UK, where he was awarded political asylum. There's also, I'm going to skip this, we also have this kind of model or schema of extraterritorial authoritarian politics. What do you do to go after exiles if you're sort of Central Asian governments and security services? Part of what we wanted to do with the book is to create a live kind of tool for sort of activists and researchers, which we call the Central Asian Political Exile Database. So some of John's students at the University of Exeter, with some input from the University of Newcastle, created the first edition, 125 Central Asian exiles, now 160. We only identify those ones by public data. And here's the breakdown. They tend to be mostly from Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, less so from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, but they're also there as well. And you can sort of, if you go online, you can see the tool, see the histories, play around with it, help add to it and improve it if you like. So I just want to give you three very brief vignettes of how this plays out in practice. This gentleman here, he's Kazakhstan's most wanted. This is Mukhtar Ablyazov. There's a chapter about Ablyazov in the book. I find him absolutely fascinating as a figure. Why? Because the narrative surrounding what he is and what he has done and what he represents are just so wildly different, right? So for Ablyazov himself, he's a founder of a democratic opposition party who was in prison. Then his business, BTA Bank, was sort of expropriated during the financial crisis by the Kazakh government. And the Kazakh government has dogged him ever since, trying to get him and his family members and his associates back to Kazakhstan to stand trial. For the Kazakh government, it's the exact opposite. Ablyazov pretends he's a democratic opposition figure. In reality, he is responsible for one of the greatest embezzlement schemes in modern financial history with the BTA Bank, billions of dollars, that while abroad, he actually adopted this persona of being a democratic activist to sort of give cover for his sort of financial crimes. I think what I find really interesting about Ablyazov is how the two parts of the book's story, the sort of shell companies, kleptocracy, kind of global networks, come together with a political part, right? So we know from arbitration transcript handlings that Ablyazov himself made use of hundreds and hundreds of shell companies to camouflage his holdings from Kazakh regulators because he felt they were going to be politically targeted. And this was just a statement of former Kazakh foreign minister on Ablyazov, why in no way can we classify him as anything but an enemy of the state to Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan has every right to defend themselves from him. This is a map of all of Ablyazov's associates and where they ended up. And what really interesting pattern, sort of his accountant, his, what do we have, 2 minutes, yeah, his accountant, his security service provider, wife and daughter. What's really fascinating in all these cases is that all these associates have been placed under Interpol red notices. They're picked up, sometimes with the help, with some nudge of sort of tip-offs. And local law enforcement pick them up. And then when it gets to the point of a high court proceedings, all of these courts, with the exception of the Moscow one, find that the case is politically motivated, right? And what happened in just sort of December sort of reflects this. So Ablyazov was scheduled for extradition that had been approved by the French Prime Minister, and the Conseil d'Etat, the highest administrative court in France, annulled this on the grounds that it was politically motivated. This is the first time since Franco that the court has actually intervened in an extradition case, right? And also there was a big scandal that nearly brought down the Italian government when his daughter and wife were sort of put on an airplane forcibly outside of Rome, rendered to Kazakhstan. A UN Human Rights Committee declared this to be a illegal rendition and sort of came back. This is a map of Tajik exiles. The sort of color-coded, the white dot means these are all figures who have been forcibly rendered back, right? So this is collaboration between the FSB and Tajik security services in Russia, right? Russia is no longer a safe space for Central Asian political exiles and dissidents. Also activities going on in Turkey, such as the fate of Umar Ali Kuvatov, who fled Tajikistan, 2014, made stops in the Gulf, in Moscow, in Istanbul, where he was actually gunned down in circumstances. And then, of course, Gulnara Karimova. I'm out of time here, so I won't get into her case as much. But basically, she's been the subject of money laundering probes and corruption probes in 10 countries. Assets have been frozen here and elsewhere. A Dutch prosecutor made the actual claim now that it's not just president's relative, that in fact she was the person who beneficially owned the shell company, Tacalant, registered in Gibraltar, that facilitated multi-stages of deals between Teliasonera, a Scandinavian telecom firm wanting access to the Uzbek market, and a system of sort of kickbacks that was structured and set up. What's really interesting from an IR perspective of this case is, what do you do now with these frozen funds, right? So to me, this is actually one of the biggest bilateral issues currently at stake in the U.S.-Uzbek relationship. Do you set up a charitable fund the way you did after Kazakhgate, like the Boda Foundation? Do you send a rebate to Uzbek telecom consumers who have been sort of harmed and injured? Do you set up an account to buy military hardware? That's been sort of proposed out there. What do you do with these frozen funds? Uzbek government says, hey, these are the result of sort of corrupt acts. Give us back the money. We're reluctant to do that until we can find some sort of institutional arrangement. And there's actually no best practices in asset recovery either. It's really long, complicated, drawn-out process. So just wrapping up, this assumption of Central Asia is globally isolated is just theoretically and empirically wrong. After 25 years, Central Asian elites especially are highly, yet selectively, globalized in terms of their own kinds of dealings and affairs. And sort of increasingly implicated in national governance networks. My point here is that if we don't know if traditional governance and democracy work is going to survive. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But if it does survive, it needs to address this transnational dimension much more systematically and openly. It's just not good enough anymore to sort of say, hey, why are you all so corrupt? Take some measures of sort of transparency. We're as much, and some of our institutions and brokers and gatekeepers, part of the problem as they are there. And there's also a recommendation there I can get in there about public due diligence, especially in a lot of the cases I've mentioned that if you're a publicly traded company and you commission a due diligence study, this should be made available at least to your shareholders. Okay, thank you.
Well, a tour de force by all of our panelists. And I think the metaphor of bad connectivity versus good connectivity is quite a powerful way to approach this. I might kind of start from that with the first question and then turn it over to the audience, and probably directed more to Professor Zhao, but others are free to chime in. One of the first things that we discovered in looking into logistics and transit is that hard infrastructure, for example, in getting things to Afghanistan, it wasn't the lack of hard infrastructure that was the biggest obstacle, although it was a problem. It wasn't the physical security issues, although that was a problem. The biggest problem in this, and this has to do with frankly, logistics anywhere in the world, is political, and it's bureaucratic. It is corruption. It is holding up materials at the border. And so the whole kind of legal framework, harmonization of customs, regulations, and what many of us call the soft infrastructure That's the most important piece about making all of this work. And I guess the question about this, the Silk Road economic belt piece of this is, part of it is a question: to what extent are these projects really being evaluated on commercial viability? Because if they're not commercially viable, then the countries that are accepting the loans to build these things, even at reduced interest rates, they're going to find themselves deeply indebted, and they're not going to be able to pay it off. And that is a concern. That could destabilize that country. In particular, in looking at, I know this doesn't exactly tie to Central Asia, but you mentioned the China-Pakistan economic corridor. The fact that, you referred to the border dispute between India and China, India and Pakistan. And so essentially, from a legal standpoint, Pakistan does not border China. And so if this connectivity is to be commercially viable, that problem has to be resolved. You cannot have any commercial traffic in there. Who's going to insure goods that are going through territory which is under dispute? But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the issue of commercial viability of the projects. There was an Indian general in town last week or 10 days ago here at Georgetown talking about CPEC, and you can imagine his perspective on things. But he did seem to make a pretty good argument that the port of Gwadar, it's virtually impossible to imagine this being commercially viable. That this port is, certainly it's being built as a naval base. But at any rate, let me turn it to you and anybody else that might want to comment, and then we'll turn it to the floor.
I think that's a great question. And actually, well, let's go back in history. For example, the real Silk Road in history, it's not really a mass transit sort of commercial line linking China with the European countries. Actually, it's precious goods, like diamonds, like very high value goods that's been transported because you're using camel and using cow, this kind of transit, vehicles to transit those things between. So there are books, historical studies on the Silk Road, and it's not really, economically, it's not big in volume, and it's not really lasting that long. So I think Silk Road is mostly remembered in our memory. It's sort of imagination and romanticized in many ways. That's number one. Number two, I totally agree with you. It's in many ways, as I said, the beginning of the OBOR is actually strategically motivated.
Right.
It's not for commercial interest. And you're totally right. If Gwadar is a viable port, then why hasn't it been built in the past 2,000 years?
Yeah.
Right? And and Karachi is not far away. And also the same thing happened in Myanmar.
It's a very good question.
Yeah, if you look at the map, the port is located in a region that within 400 miles, there's no good population centers. So it's very hard to say that's commercially viable. So that's why when China is trying to build CPEC, there's a great dispute within Pakistan trying to figure out which way. So now we have three ways: the east way, the central way, the west way. The west way is basically the minority in Pakistan trying to struggle for more money for them. And the east way is the central Pakistan government is sort of trying to benefit in their hometown. And the central way is Chinese government saying, okay, we're going to balance this too. And we created the third line and giving everybody a piece of it. So it's a compromise, ultimately. There's a sort of signature trip between Kashgar to Gwadar just a couple of months ago, showing off that the line is opening up. However, along the way, they spent about 3,000 people just to guarantee the safety of the transport. How much that's going to cost. And also, they created a small fleet, about 4 ships, guarding the port. So I don't think it's economically viable. As I said, it's a group of strategic thinkers advocating to the Chinese government, and then there's special interests that got involved, and they built these ports and roads to get money for themselves, not necessarily creating economic benefit or returns, profit, for that matter. And there are a lot of those companies are state-owned enterprises. However, if the leadership think that the strategic gain is worth it, then how can you stop it, right? So that's the thing. But then, coming back to Central Asia, I think there's still opportunity to be explored. For China, looking at the map, because European Union is #1 trading partner with China. And there are two ways to go through it, right? One is the ocean lane, and one is the land bridge. So looking at the map, China feels that Central Asia is a sort of lower ground that can be developed and leveling up. So one of the things to do, and also considering the population that this morning we talk about, they're very young compared to China's population structure. So it's worth to explore probably the lower cost labor in that region. And also when China wanted to develop the Western regions economically, adjacent areas can provide resources, then that's good too. So I think there's still good opportunity, but they should be market-based, not state-pushed. So that's a future things that Chinese government still have to consider, and particularly when the fiscal problems, it's because right now Chinese government has a lot of money and they don't really quite worry about investment loss. But then in the future, at a certain point, they will have to reconsider it.
Right. Thank you. Bill.
A different issue of commercial viability. And the Obama administration, particularly in the first part of the Obama administration, was promoted the idea of a new Silk Road that would be Afghan-centric, a north-south Silk Road, which was as far from commercial viability as anyone could imagine. The Taliban activities ended up causing that idea to die a quiet death. So it's probably good to keep the State Department away from decisions that involve commercial viability. So if you look at the State Department record, turning down the commercially viable Keystone Pipeline and supporting the uncommercially viable north-south route.
I saw the so-called State Department economic strategy for Afghanistan in 2010, and just to suffice to say that this would not pass as a Harvard Business School case study. Okay, it was a list of 26 things. All of them are nice things. No sense of what the connection of one was to the other, let alone the how you would implement it and what the result would be, et cetera. Okay, I've got David first, and then we'll move back. Please identify yourself for the panelists.
David Abramson. So this is a really interesting discussion because we have examples of China, Russia, and the U.S. all pursuing commercially non-viable in the interest of strategic. Strategery. Sorry, no, I'm not going to use that. And yet, China has the money to do that. The U.S. has the money, but isn't really willing to put up very much behind it. And Russia doesn't have the money, except in the way that they, sort of shell game like redistribute their resources to try to pursue these. So I'm wondering if any of the panelists could comment on, how. I mean, this isn't an unusual phenomenon. Everyone's doing it in different ways. Does anyone want to pull that together? For me, anyway.
If I could comment quickly, former Secretary of State accused Russia of seeking to re-Sovietize the area with the Eurasian Customs Union. Now there's Eurasian Economic Union. And there's a real issue there. Eurasian Economic Union is probably here to stay. It has a lot of faults, high external tariff wall, extreme domination by one country that has 5/6 of the GDP of Eurasian Economic Union. But it's here to stay. So with regard to your country, as we were discussing about Uzbekistan, would it make sense for Uzbekistan to go into the Eurasian Economic Union, partly because transportation routes and other things, go up through Kazakhstan, Russia, or is the Eurasian Economic Union so fatally flawed that it would be better for it not to be there? There's some important issues there, both certainly for U.S. policy. U.S. policy was opposed kind of to the Eurasian Economic Union before. That's quieted down. It really doesn't have much of a policy, nor does Europe. But there's some real issues there about the Eurasian Economic Union and what should be its future.
I think the overemphasis
on infrastructure as a thing in and of itself is incredibly damaging, right? Because it's almost as if we want to focus on the infrastructure because we don't want to talk about the politics and the corruption and so forth, right? It's like a safe topic to promote. But in fact, you can't think of doing the hardware without the software, right? It's sort of said before. And it's not just sort of the software, it's concrete steps to, say, liberalize trade services, right? So how are you going to how is society going to reap the benefits, the economic benefits of better highways, better roads, better railways if those transit sectors that use the infrastructures aren't improved, right? There's still state monopolies that accrue these sort of transit fees. They're just going to go to the same parties, except you're going to have much bigger sources of rent, right? So I think that's part of the problem in that wanting to just be safe and just talk about the infrastructure. Not everyone does this, but I think, I think, both in certain U.S. and Chinese circles, sort of thing. Well, we don't want to talk about geopolitics. It's just about connectivity. It's like, well, connectivity actually is geopolitics. A, and B, you're actually missing an important piece of the development task here. And there's some good work on landlocked countries in Africa that sort of bear this out too. Just to pick up on Bill's point on OBOR and EEU, maybe I'm just really cynical on this. I just see these as really antithetical economic projects in terms of their architectures, right? The Belt and Road is about the domestic stuff too, but it's about moving stuff through Central Asia, right? Whereas the EU is about walling off Central Asia as an economic space. So the way that Moscow tries to marry this is sort of say, well, we'll have contact groups, or we supply the regulations and the rules, and you supply the capital, as if sort of, China doesn't have an understanding of regulations and rules. It's just kind of a strange justification. But I think, the economic momentum and gravity is with Beijing, so they'll go along with this. And if it takes a few working and contact groups to sort of give assurances to Russia, I think that's a price worth sort of paying. But I don't see how these concepts are compatible. And to again just reduce them to the infrastructure project, right? And say, oh, we're working together on the Kazan high-speed railway, right? That to me again misses the bigger kind of legal and political and architectural questions here.
My response to your question, David, would be, I think there has to be much more. This is, first of all, Professor Zhao is absolutely right. The Silk Road is a wrong metaphor, because the Silk Road itself, it really was a network of trading routes that emerged, and they were commercially driven. And so I think the answer is that what's going to happen, the good kind of connectivity is going to be principally commercially driven, and to the extent that there needs to be, government involvement, then you have a public-private partnership. But the biggest obstacle to this working is simply, in many places, you have states where, who is acting in the national interest of the broader population. Typically, countries that are operating in the interests of a few people, and that's what I see as the biggest obstacle to this working in a way that would be beneficial at the human level, at the commercial level. Professor Zhao,
can I just say one word? 2 points. Number one, there's a small difference between the Belt and Road. There's a nuance because the Belt was actually offered by President Xi Jinping in 2013 of October, and then the Road is actually first offered by Premier Li Keqiang in Southeast Asia.
Right.
So actually, if you compare the two, they're actually very different. However, they combine those to a national strategy. But if you look at history, actually the Sea Road makes much more sense because economically that's viable.
Right.
And that Xi's offer is more strategic, more looking. And number two, I think to Alexander's problem is that it's a developmental ideological difference, the Washington consensus versus the Beijing consensus, right? So to a certain extent, the infrastructure sort of drive is a reflection of China's ideology, of China's personal experience. Right. That historically, for the past 30, 40 years, China built road first, and then those villages bring those counties, villages online, and then gradually they have economic development. So that's Chinese idea. If no matter how corrupt, we don't care about political structure and also corruption issues. We build the road first. When the economy grows, this problem will take care of itself. So I think that's the different thinking.
Reminds
right
me
here.
of the wonderful baseball movie Field of Dreams. Build the field, they will come. Okay, let's turn back to the audience. Maybe collect a couple of comments. Maybe we'll collect 3 questions, comments, and then turn over to the panel to address as they see fit.
Thank you very much. My name is Jeff Denoda. I'm in the School of Foreign Service as a grad student. My question is mainly for Dr. Cooley. I have your book. It's pretty fascinating. And I wanted to think more along the lines of a firm level. So, we talked about corruption, the risk of corruption, but at the same time, firms from the West, and these are firms that want to comply with FCPA. They don't want to they don't want to get their hands dirty, but at the same time, there's all these mazes that they have to navigate through. So from your experience, from your expertise and vantage point, and the other panelists can comment, what would be your sort of top 3 advice that you would give to a firm looking at, say, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, something like that?
Like to Chevron, for example. Pick one. Yes.
Thank you. Richard Jordan from the Royal Academy of Science International Trust. A question for Professor Zhao. One aspect of Belt and Road is supposed to be a people-to-people exchange, maybe supposed to be going back to Eisenhower, I don't know, that time. But who are the people? I mean, certainly millions of tourists aren't going to come to see Belt and Road. So what types of people do China envision coming through Belt and Road?
Okay. Yes, Bill.
Bill Veal, President Emeritus of the U.S. Kazakhstan Business Association. Congratulations for an excellent conference and a great panel, too. I have a question that tries to address maybe the regional context in this. The C5, I'm not talking about +1, but C5, looks at this region, but this is a region that has the lowest level of intra-regional trade of any region in the world. Yep. And I'm wondering if members of the panel, from your perspectives, would address what you see as the prospects for trade generation within Central Asia and getting Central Asians sort of doing this for themselves, since you can't count on that much new FDI coming into the area.
Okay, I'm glad we got that question on the table for sure. Let's turn back to the panelists. Alex, the first question was directed to you.
That's a broad way to put it. Firm level compliance to the FCPA. I mean, the FCPA it's really a very strong extraterritorial tool that we have. And in some ways, I want to flip your question and sort of say, even though there's sort of anti-corruption laws and standards elsewhere, it's a relatively new thing. Right? The anti-corruption regime doesn't come together until the 1990s, really the late 1990s, till 1998. If you're a corporation in Germany, you can write off overseas bribe from your corporate taxes, right? So this is something that comes together relatively late, that the U.S., because of its extraterritorial jurisdiction and the way sort of it operates in terms of sort of companies that are listed and so forth, occupies a unique kind of position. Part of the key to that is ensuring a separation of powers, right, between the DOJ and the SEC and the State Department and the Pentagon, on the other hand, right? And for the most part, it does this, right? Not that these issues aren't discussed in sort of interagencies, but that's really the key to sort of this legislation sort of functioning the way it's meant to be. Because, on the Central Asian side, these things are linked. Like, come on, can't you make this Kazakh Gate stuff go away, right? Kind of like, no, we can't, right? Because this is an investigation, has its own, it's walled off, it's sealed up. So I think it's really important to keep those distinctions and those jurisdictions separate going forward. Because the minute those start to be traded off and overtly politicized, you're going to have really the potential for a very big mess on your hands. In terms of sort of the credibility of sort of the U.S. on that. I actually think, in sort of my experience, it's energy companies, Western energy companies tend to have much more highly tuned compliance procedures. It's actually companies without experience in the region who say, wow, what a great opportunity to grow our sort of cellular network, right? Look at Uzbekistan, look at Azerbaijan. These are like open markets. And they get into it without sort of a real sense and understanding, or they sort of delegate out the due diligence to someone who gives them enough sort of strategic ambiguity that they think they can go away with it. This is always going to come out in the wash, right? If you're using shell companies, if you're bribing the president's sort of relatives and so forth, this is, and I guess you're not used to doing it, you're going to get caught out. And I think that's what you see with the telecom settlements in Uzbekistan. These were all pretty crude, worked out schemes. They all followed the same playbook. And frankly, just even the crisis management reaction to it was really poor, right? You cut out, don't double down and sort of insist. And so, it took the Telia sort of CEO, and we're not done with that. So I think it's a tough question to answer sort of fully, because I think there's so many nuances and moving parts, but I think you have to start from the premise that we have to keep our justice and our State Department sides of the ledger here separate for this to work.
Dr. Zhao, what about the people?
Well, thank you for the question. It's a great question. I think, first of all, when we talk about that, we always relate it to Joseph Nye's talk about soft power. And China was really influenced by that and thinking, we're economically strong now, but we don't have cultural soft power. Therefore, this so-called people-to-people communication is really a way to increase so-called China's soft power. For example, one case in point is this Confucius Institute, which is really a language school teaching Chinese. A lot of, it's all over the world now, and it's occupying the great building in central Beijing. So I think going forward, China would like to educate more overseas students coming into China, and I think the president of Ethiopia is graduated from Peking University. And when you have more people studied in China, appreciate China's system, they're more likely to go back to their country and use China's as a model. So I think that's one way to sort of show influence. And tourism, of course, is a big component of it. And now China is more and more likely to use tourism as a weapon against any country that is not really friendly with China. So yeah, I think it's going to be,
Paul or Bill, do you want to take a cut at the lack of intra-Central Asian trade prospects to improve that?
Just with regard to the Eurasian Economic Union, about which we all have concerns, probably Uzbekistan's entry into the Eurasian Economic Union would be about the only thing that could really move the needle in terms of substantially increasing trade within the region. Uzbekistan is the only country that borders on all four of the other Central Asian countries. It's got a large consumer population. Kazakhstan has difficulty attracting some manufacturing and other business because they don't have a large enough population to sell to. If you brought Uzbekistan in, and if the Eurasian Economic Union actually works as a rules-based union, and that's the biggest single if, then you could have a pretty substantial common market in Central Asia.
I would just say that I think when we're looking at this problem, clearly Uzbekistan was the biggest obstacle to connectivity. And so with a new government in Uzbekistan, and if they're looking at some of these issues anew, and it sounds like there is, to some extent, at least in the first 6 months, as David Abramson was suggesting, that would be very positive. And I think the real key is the Kazakh-Uzbek relationship. And these are by far the two largest economies. I think there's some complementarity there. And when I was at CSIS, we had a visiting fellow, an economist, Aytotlin Kormanova, and this was an issue that she was looking at very, very, very closely and was reasonably optimistic about even a couple of years ago. Okay, I think we have time maybe for, yes, a couple more questions. Yeah, Dave, yes, over here, and then David, and then we'll wrap it up and invite Dr. Stent to give the final blessing.
I have a question to Dr. Zhao. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yes.
Just follow up to something you said in regards to some barriers to people movement and trade tariffs and visa barriers, and you mentioned Russia has something to do with it. Could you please elaborate on that?
Okay, and David?
So just a comment first about the Eurasian Economic Union and Uzbekistan joining. There are lots of issues with respect to movement of labor migrants back and forth, and then with this new trend for now of many Uzbeks involved in individuals involved in terrorist acts around that, some of which can come back to bite Russia increasingly. I wonder that could put a twist in open borders and that more open borders between Russia and Uzbekistan. But I have a question about soft power going in the other direction, not bringing people to China to understand the Chinese perspective, but what about Chinese social scientists and people doing assessments of development projects, One Belt, One Road, infrastructure and other projects on site in Central Asia and everywhere else to assess everything from economic viability, if that is a concern, or security issues or management of the projects. I didn't see a lot of that a couple of years ago when I went and talked with people at think tanks and universities in Beijing and Shanghai. But I wonder if there's a movement more in that direction.
Okay, Dr. Zhao?
Maybe I'll answer Dev's question first and then go to yours. First of all, I think in that area, I agree with you, there's a lot of people from China going out and doing research, but most of the people who are specialized on those are not in the universities. They're in the companies. And in a lot of SOEs, there are institutions within like state grade, like dam building companies, like railway construction companies, road construction companies. They have very good research department within those. And they send people overseas, stationed there for a couple of years. They have very deep knowledge of the local area. And also private companies like Huawei, it held all kinds of conferences and sponsor researchers going to other countries in South Asia, in the Belt and Road countries. So I think that in that respect, yes, they have a lot of sort of communications. But then I think we're lacking behind. A lot of people in the academia in China doesn't have that enough money or language skills to go to those countries. They're not specially trained for those kind of travels and interactions. So I think that's going to catch up because the more of the Chinese language universities, colleges are transforming themselves into regional and state study, national study universities. So more and more language people will be trained in the future. And back to your question, I think there are two sets of questions. For visa, that's because of labor problem. For example, Kazakhstan has very tight visa for Chinese to go in there. It's even tighter than the US. One of the reasons is that they don't want a lot of Chinese laborers to go in there, and they believe that those people are sort of replacing local laborers and not giving them enough opportunities. The other thing is that like goods standards, and that involves Russia, because Russia want to come in and sort of integrate the Central Asia countries first with Russia and then with China. So they sort of wanted those countries take that as a priority. However, China's standard, a lot of compliance is with the United States and with European countries for export purpose. So it's kind of hard for China to first asking Central Asia countries to agree with China's standard and then agree with Russia's. So Russia comes in first. So in a lot of ways, when China want to push in free trade and negotiate with Central Asia countries, they sort of stuck at a certain point because those countries have not complete economic deals with Russia yet. Right. So it may not be an intentional delay, but it's kind of hurdle for China.
May not be intentional. Okay, Paul, Bill, Alex, anybody want to make a final word or comment?
Just one thing on sort of the potential for growing regional trade cooperation. I think we're seeing this in Uzbekistan, but I think as you see more generational change in other countries as well, the potential for greater regional cooperation, I think, will increase, largely because, a lot of the first generation people were all about building their own sovereign states. And I think just sort of time and changing, situations, geoeconomic, geopolitical, and changing leadership will help bring that about.
All right. Well, this has been a terrific panel. Let me thank our speakers, and thank the audience, and turn the floor over to Dr. Stepp.
Thank you. No conference can take place if someone doesn't organize it. So I would like to thank Sarah Radomski. She did the organization of the conference for a terrific job. I want to thank Chevron again for their support, and I want to thank all of the speakers, the panelists, for a terrific conference. I've learned an enormous amount, and I have to go home and digest it now. So please join me. And I'm assuming, Alex, we can order your book from Amazon, right? Absolutely.